My name's Steve Potovan, and I'll be talking about some of the recent trends in the lower food web of Lake Michigan. Some of the things that I'll be touching on are the spring total phosphorus, the spring chlorophyll, zooplankton, mysis, Diporeia, dry-scented mussels, and veligers. And three of these things, the phosphorus, chlorophyll, and mysis, were high-ranked indicators in a recent Fish Commission report linking prey fish production to the lower food web. We'll also be contrasting the nearshore and offshore, as well as some of the seasonal patterns that we see. Starting off with a contrast between the nearshore and the offshore, and we can see that the nearshore is characterized by high variability, and that's one of the things that makes the nearshore kind of difficult to get a grasp on. But we can see that the chlorophyll in the nearshore had a spring peak and another peak in the early summer in 2021. Whereas in the offshore, the lowest levels of the year were in the spring. And then by the late summer and fall, we didn't see much difference between the nearshore and the offshore in chlorophyll concentrations. Next, looking at total phosphorus, and this is for the spring, and one of those important indicators. And this is for the Muskegon to Grand Haven area. And so these sites are highly influenced by tributary loadings. There isn't a whole lot of data, but you can see over the long term, it appears that there's been a decline in nearshore phosphorus in the spring with low levels during the last few years, and with levels in 2021 being relatively low to some of the more recent years. Next, looking at spring phosphorus in the offshore region, and you can see again, there's been a long-term decline in phosphorus during the spring in the offshore as well, with levels kind of bouncing around over low levels in the recent years, and with kind of average levels in the spring of 2021 compared to the past few years. Next, looking at the chlorophyll, and we'll be looking at this in a seasonal context, and this is for the nearshore, again for those 5 sites in southeast Lake Michigan. And you can see long term, there used to be kind of high chlorophyll levels in the spring and even into the summer, tapering off into the fall. Over the last few years, 2014 to 2019, on average, you can see that we had a peak, still have a peak chlorophyll in May, although at lower levels than what we used to see, and then declining in the summer and into the fall. For 2021, we had that early peak and then another peak in July, so a little bit of a different pattern than we've seen over the last few years, but again there was a spring peak and then again a peak again in the summer. Looking at the offshore chlorophyll, and again on a seasonal context, in the past we had the spring bloom in the 1980s and 1990s with peak chlorophyll occurring in May. And then if you look at the 2021 data, you can see that May is actually our lowest chlorophyll levels during the whole year. And then once we get into the late summer and into the fall, you see that chlorophyll now isn't that much different, or maybe even higher than it was in the 1980s and 1990s. If we compare 2021 to the last few years, you can see that 2021 was really an average year compared to the last few years for chlorophyll concentrations in the offshore. It really tracking the long-term average for 2014 to 2019. Next, I want to look at some of the zooplankton data, and this is the average annual zooplankton from a nearshore and an offshore site near Muskegon. And you can see that there's a lot more data available for the offshore than the nearshore. And in the offshore, we definitely see a decline over time in terms of zooplankton biomass. In the nearshore, it's a little bit more difficult to determine the long-term trend. But we do see that 2021 in the nearshore was relatively low zooplankton biomass compared to most years, whereas in the offshore, at least compared to recent years, it was a fairly average year. Also want to point out some of the differences that we see between the nearshore and the offshore. First of all, in the nearshore, the small-bodied Bosmina is the main cladoceran, whereas in the offshore, the large-bodied Daphnia is the main cladoceran. And that might reflect higher predation pressures in the nearshore than in the offshore. Also, we see that the calanoid copepods are the dominant group, especially in the offshore, and that really reflects the oligotrophic conditions that we see there. Next, looking at the seasonal patterns for 2021 compared to the last few years. And the seasonal patterns in 2021 in the nearshore were kind of unique, kind of up and down throughout the year, a little bit different than what we see on average. Again, we see that the annual mean is relatively low compared to what we've been seeing over the last few years in 2021. And interestingly, the community in 2021 was almost all calanoid copepods and bosmina, with very low biomass of Daphnia, cyclopoid copepods, and dreissennid veligers. Looking at the seasonal pattern in the offshore for 2021 versus the last few years, again, we see that the annual mean was just about right on par with what we've seen as the average for those last few years. And the seasonal pattern wasn't all that remarkable, pretty average, with the main differences being that it peaked a little bit earlier than it does on average, peaking in September instead of October. And then we also saw fewer Daphnia in 2021 than we do on average at the offshore site. Next, looking at mysis abundance. You remember mysis are one of those important indicator groups linking the lower food web to fish production, and they're a large macroinvertebrate in the lake eaten by many of the fish. And we can see with this data from 2 sites near Muskegon that long-term there have been declines in mysis, but they are persisting, but at very low levels, and 2021 was no exception to that, with low levels of mysis, but they are persisting at these sites. In 2015, as part of the CSMI effort, there was we were able to combine the EPA, USGS, and NOAA data sets to get a lake-wide perspective on mysis. And a couple of the important findings from this that were recently published in a paper were that mysis are highest offshore, which is probably no surprise, with biomass generally higher in the north than in the south, and also that production in 2015 was less than values reported for 2007 to 2011, and probably has declined since. Next, looking at Diporeia density. With Diporeia have the well-documented decline over time, and this is the lake-wide data through 2015. The survey was not completed in 2020, but it was completed in 2021, so we're still awaiting those results. But there have been surveys in the southern basin each year since 2015, and what we've seen are continued decline of Diporeia in 2016 to 2019 in the southern basin, with none found in 2019 or 2020 at this one site where they had persisted. So we've seen a continued decline of Diporeia, at least in the southern basin, and we'll await what we see from the lake-wide survey in 2021 with what's going on further north. Next, looking at the lake-wide abundance of quagga mussels, and this shows the rapid expansion of mussels through 2015. Again, the lake-wide survey was completed in 2021, and Ashley has told me she hopes to have the new updated lake-wide maps by the end of this year, so we anticipate that. We do have some data sets on quagga mussel trends since 2015 that provides information on the population trends since that last lake-wide survey. And this is some data from 2 sites near Muskegon that is collected 3 times a year. And you can see that based on this data, it appears that at this site you see a decline since 2012, and at this site fairly stable levels since 2012. And so it does appear that mussel populations, at least in this area, are in decline or stabilizing, although at fairly high numbers. At that 100-meter site, we have around 10,000 per square meter. Another important thing to keep in mind is that sites such as this 100-meter site, the mussels are relatively small, and so they're continuing to grow. So even if we have stable numbers, the biomass of mussels may still be increasing. Another variable that we've been looking at are the veliger densities. And this is from the 153 net, so it's probably not indicative of total veliger densities, but of the larger veligers that are ready to settle out. You see interesting trends at these 15 and 45 meter sites over time, but at all three of these sites in 2021, we had low veliger densities, and so that's encouraging. So in summary, for some of the things that we saw for 2021, in terms of spring phosphorus, chlorophyll, and zooplankton, I think one of the big messages is that a lot of the declines that we saw in the early 2000s have stabilized, especially for the offshore, and now we're looking at more of year-to-year variability. For 2021 in the nearshore, a lot of these indicators were relatively low compared to recent years, whereas in the offshore, 2021 seemed to be a pretty average year compared to the most recent years. For mysis, they persist, but at very low numbers compared to what they have been in the past. And I just also point out that there's a Fish Commission project that will be looking at some of the causes of these declines, and we'll also be doing some near bottom sampling to see if there's mysis biomass that our traditional net sampling is missing. For Diporeia, their numbers remain low, and in fact, none were collected in the Southern Basin surveys in 2019 and 2020, and so their numbers certainly have not recovered, and they may be actually getting worse in some areas. For quagga mussels, it does appear that populations could be stabilizing based on the limited amount of data that we have available at this point. The 2021 lake-wide and Southern Basin surveys should be available at the end of this year, and that should provide a better picture of what's going on with the quagga mussels. We did see continued low abundance of veligers in 2021, and just as a follow-up on that, we're doing intensive work on the veliger dynamics and linking that to mussel recruitment, and that started in 2021 and will continue in 2022. And that's all that I have. Thank you.